Bryan Palmer edits the journal Labour Le Travail and has authored a number of books on labor and the left in Canada. His most recent books are Revolutionary Teamsters and with Gaetan Heroux, Rebellious History. A 2-volume collection of his essays, Marxism and Historical Practice, was published in 2015.
Well, first let me thank Scott for organizing this and the Socialist Project. I'm delighted to be here to honor Carol and Carl's magnificent work. I think that having it all together in this room and Mr. Miller, who curated this, is that the term? It's a wonderful exhibition. I think they must be getting a swelled head though after all this time. Somebody's really got to write a forceful critique of what's actually wrong with this work. It won't be me because I can't imagine what that would say, but somebody should. Joan mentioned all the things, and I'm sure all of you who've seen the exhibition understand all the things that their work touches on. One of the things, and I won't go over that, but one of the things that's central to the work is precarity. And this has particularly been a recent concern. And I think they've addressed that, and I think we all need to be addressing that. One of my, and I'm not, this is not a critique because I know they don't fall into this trap, but one of the traps is that we've been led to believe by some of the writing on precarity that it's somehow the foundation of a new class formation. The precariousness is somehow, it has taken over and it's created a new class, particularly of precarious youth. And this sells well to young people who see, understandably, their circumstances as, quite dire in the current moment. But what it obscures and forgets, and I think papers over, as some of the things that Joan was talking about have been papered over, is the extent to which precariousness is integral to proletarianization for centuries of history. And what Marx, for instance, took as his understanding of proletarianization goes back to ancient Greece and Rome, when the proles were those who had nothing, who were dispossessed. And this is really the foundation of a long book on Toronto's poor that Gaetan and I have worked on, and that Between the Lines will be publishing later this year. We've looked at the rebellious history of Toronto's poor, the sort of uprisings and mobilizations of people who were unemployed or who were casually employed or who were dependent on various forms of relief, pre the welfare state, the House of Industry in the 19th century, going through various periods and up to the present time. And really, when you look at class formation, it is only that brief moment historically from 1945 to roughly 1975, when capitalism supposedly provided the goods, that you could speak of class formation in any way, shape, or form that somehow stepped outside of precarity. And even that is a mythology. Even that is actually wrong. So what I'm going to do tonight is I'm going to actually step forward from Joan's earlier historical talk, and I'll move into the period of the Great Depression. I'm going to do a very narrow snapshot, and the talk that I'm going to be addressing could be titled "They Shall Not Pass," which is a term that was actually emerged out of World War I, but was then taken up by, of course, in the midst of the Spanish Civil War. And it draped homes in Toronto in the 1930s in banners that proclaimed resistance to evictions. And I'm going to talk about the way in which a working class dispossessed, a working class facing a crisis of production, also faced a crisis of reproduction. The way a crisis of unemployment was also a crisis of housing. And the ways in which, in the midst of the dire circumstances of the 1930s, evictions became a centerpiece in the class struggle. And I think this is important because it reminds us of the way the class struggle, in some senses, has to unfold on many fronts. And it brings us back to understandings, which I'll close with, about what a project of class struggle in our own times really needs to be about. And I'm going to just focus very, very very much on actually only a couple of cases. There were thousands of evictions in the Toronto of this period. In the book that Gaetan and I have done, we look rather closely at about 40, but really it's the tip of an iceberg. To give you some sense of the dimensions of the crisis of the 1930s, in June of 1931, of Toronto's 242,000 wage earners, fully 40,500 were not working. From August to November of 1931, over 36,000 unemployed men registered with the Toronto Central Bureau of Employment Relief, over 16,000 of them single, almost 20,000 of them married with dependents. A large number of these men were returned soldiers. 60% could be classified as unskilled or semi-skilled, and only 1/3 of the wages were born in Canada, which meant that they could actually be, many of them who hadn't lived here 5 years, could be deported if they were actually found to be on relief. Many were, of course, forced to turn to institutions of relief, such as the House of Industry, which saw the number of Toronto families drawing from its resources increase from just under 3,500 in 1929 to over 20,000 in 1932. The almost 63,000 Torontonians who drew relief in January of that year constituted roughly 10% of the then population of 634,000. But in specific working class suburbs like East York, the crisis of unemployment and wagelessness hit even much harder, with the percentage of residents on assistance approaching 30% in January 1934 and surpassing 45% in February of 1935. So with about 8% of the nation's population, Toronto paid out in what was a chaotic and almost informal pre-welfare state system of relief. Toronto paid out almost 20% of the country's relief bill. So this was a major crisis. The Canadian Communist leader, Tim Buck, claimed that by November, December 1930, evictions had become a socio-economic guillotine hanging over the collective head of a working class decimated by joblessness and facing homelessness. Metro Toronto, Buck claimed, faced some 13,000 dispossession orders. Buck's figures can be questioned, but his assessment of the central importance of resistance to evictions by the unemployed movement, which emerged in this period, and which I'm covering in the roughly 1932 to 1936 period tonight. In every city of Canada, Buck said, our program against the crisis boiled down into a struggle against evictions for relief and to organize the unemployed. To do this, the Communist Party of Canada and many others who joined created networks of roaming activists, underemployed and unemployed workers who pledged themselves ready at any given moment to go to the assistance of workers threatened with evictions. Word received at a central office, which might be the home of a particular leader of a neighborhood association or a more formal storefront address. The signal would go out, we would rush off. Sometimes these flying militants would be given streetcar tickets by their organization. On occasion, they transported people in cars or trucks owned by colleagues and comrades. A designated group often telephoned others of the need to support an ongoing eviction protest and to appear at an address where sheriffs were threatening a family and heft was needed to haul furniture back into homes. In Toronto's Cabbagetown, the anti-eviction committee was said to be led by an Irishman known as Hammer the Mug. These vigilante bodies then, as a 1933 article on evictions in the Globe detailed, could muster more than 200 members at a moment's notice. They were committed to spend all day camped out on front and rear verandas, thwarting those who sought to execute the hated warrants of eviction. Communist rank-and-filer Dick Steele participated in a number of these Cabbagetown protests, battling bailiffs with bravado, going so far as to rip the court orders from the hands of the sheriff and then do a runner with it into a maze of district alleyways. Steele understood that such actions were merely in some senses stalling for time, but they did impress upon the masses of the unemployed that it was possible through solidarity and struggle to resist. Bill Walsh, Steele's comrade and close friend, concluded, "We believe that if enough people took on the local authorities, someday soon they might well be ready to take on the state." So evictions then and resistance to them could happen in many ways and involve all manner of scenarios. I want to detail just two cases for you and give you some of the flavor of this. One of the most dramatic eviction confrontations took place at the Mishka home, where a 31-year-old mother of two, where a 31-year-old mother and two of her four children were startled on the first day of June 1933 by a bailiff appearing at her front door, ordering her to pile all the furniture in the backyard. The Mishkas had missed a single month of their rental payments. Mrs. Mishka, informing the bailiff that she was sick and was declining to move anything, locked her door, only to have the determined repo agent break a window, grab a key hanging from a wall, and enter the premises. The first object he attempted to seize was a baby carriage. With Mrs. Mishka and the bailiff skirmishing, doors were locked, keys fought over, and then some neighborhood women appeared. When we saw the bailiffs go into Mrs. Mishka's house, we went right across to help her, reported one of them. We knew she was very sick and she should not be moved. Four of we women entered together, and we made for the bailiff who had been struggling with our friend. We pulled his hair, punched him, scratched him, hit him, and we threw him out the door. A group of men from the Toronto Unemployed Council then showed up and chased the other two eviction officers from the house. A defense guard of 40 unemployed stood vigil over the Mishka residence for 24 hours, posting a crayon cardboard sign in the window, "The Toronto Council of the Unemployed will fight eviction." Proud of its successful turning back of another eviction the day before, the Unemployed Council vowed it had 300 men ready to assist and to resist all debt collectors and would fight in every case. Those who would turn people out of their homes and seize their small domestic belongings were warned not to appear on the street. "The bailiffs will get worse than they got the first time," promised one leader of the unemployed. "We don't like bailiffs down here." The popular defense of the Mishka household highlighted ways that women might become central players in protests of the unemployed. This, of course, was a logical development in struggles that were directly aimed at preservation of homes, protections of domestic units, and the defense of women, children, and their human rights to shelter, clothing, and living space. An East York eviction of a Mrs. Patterson and her family, at least two of whom were grown sons, illustrated vividly the increasing importance of women in the struggles against eviction. The Patterson eviction had been known about in East York for some time, the home-owning Mrs. Patterson being in arrears on tax payments due on her house at 598 Woodbine Avenue. She had been in arrears for a considerable period of time, possibly a number of years. The Board of Control of the City of Toronto was of the view that it was in the interests of the city that the matter be brought to a head, and so ordered the eviction. They apparently rejected some kinds of compromise proposed by the Department of Welfare, and on the morning of 7 July 1936, the Reverend Wallace Christie and one of Patterson's sons met with an acting Toronto mayor, William D. Robbins, to try to stop the sheriffs from proceeding. The meeting led to confusions, and in any case, officers were on their way to the Patterson home. They found it surrounded by men from the East York Workers Association and the Ward 8 Workers Association, in which rank-and-file communists predominated. 20 women from the neighborhood stood on the veranda, which was draped with a Union Jack. Mrs. Patterson, although having communist support, her threatened eviction managed to bring together reds and oranges, for her family had links to both the Communist Party of Canada and to the neighborhood affiliations that drew on the United Empire Loyalists to the Orange Lodge. Both sides of this incongruous network of support were of long historical standing. On the red side, Mrs. Patterson was a sister of Tom Bell, whose radicalism reached back to the Socialist Party of North America, the founding of the Communist Party of Canada, and the revolutionary organizing in Manitoba associated with the aftermath of the Winnipeg General Strike. Tom Bell had ended up a Comintern functionary, working in Moscow for several years, and the party activists in the unemployed movement were not about to let his sister be given the bailiff bum's rush. Long resident in the neighborhood, however, Mrs. Patterson had her own ties to British neighbors, many of whom would have had little knowledge of her communist brother. The sheriff's officer told the unemployed men and some of the women to move aside, but his orders were of no avail. Insistent that he would die rather than back down and not execute the warrant, Jeffrey preferred to live in the company of an armed contingent, and he left to return with confreres from the police department. A riot ensued, and police reinforcements were called in. 43 officers were eventually needed to assist Jeffrey in evicting the Patterson family. The Toronto Star described the melee. Mutters and jeers rippled through the gathering as police arrived, but it was not until one of Mrs. Patterson's sons shouted, "We'll resist to the last ditch," that the disturbance burst into flames. Charging down from the flag-draped veranda, where companions hastily sang the national anthem, an angry mob of screeching women and howling men clashed with 20 police officers yesterday afternoon when a sheriff's eviction order was carried out at the house of Mrs. Patterson. The resistance grew into a free-for-all. Women scratched the policemen and bit them. The men tussled with the constables all over the front lawn. When the squad arrived at the doorway, after much furious battle, they found it barricaded. One of the sheriff's officers then smashed a pane of glass in the front window and climbed into the living room. A bailiff and 3 policemen were then injured, along with several of the unemployed. Chivalry apparently dictated against the arrest of women, but 12 men, including both of Mrs. Patterson's adult sons, Hugh and John, were taken off to the number 10 police station. Among the party members arrested were Jack Scott, Phil Hughes, Richard Pratt, and Bill Barber Smith. A passerby swept up in the street fight was let loose by the cops, but Scott recalled, "We later recruited him to the party." Before the bloody arrestees were settled into their cells, Mrs. Patterson's friends brought them a basket of sandwiches and a gallon of iced tea. Released later that evening on $500 bail, some of the group proceeded to the corner of Woodbine and Danforth, where a protest meeting was underway, and Mrs. Patterson addressed the crowd. The next day, a deputation of 20 women from the Ward 8 Progressive Women's Association, some with babies in tow and headed by Mrs. P. Hughes, wife of a Communist Party member, attended a Toronto Board of Control meeting along with the Reverend Christie and a group of unemployed men. Plainclothes police and uniformed officers guarded the doors. Mrs. Hughes wanted to know if women were to be protected from abuse and molested by the police. Another female speaker angrily demanded to know if it was the acting mayor's order that the police tear down the British flag. "We are here to protest about this," she said. "We are orange women. We're British." Mrs. Margaret Humbleton then recounted being attacked on the veranda by police, who dragged her down the steps. Before fainting, she remembered a lot of cops shouting and lashing out with their billies everywhere. Even a Toronto Globe and Mail editorial acknowledged later that public opinion was on the side of the unfortunate victims being subjected to removal from their home. Not responsible for their situation, they should hardly be treated as hardcore members of the criminal class, editorialized a Toronto paper. But Jack Scott and some of his comrades received 20 days in the Don jail from the magistrate. 10 of the days of incarceration, Scott figured, because he refused to swear on the Bible. Now, by all accounts, this was a major battle, but it lasted barely 2 days. Other eviction resistances had more longevity. One of the more protracted, convoluted, and successful instances of anti-eviction insurgency, took place in Alderwood, as the local workers' association guarded an Albany Avenue house of a relief family for almost 20 days in the summer of 1933. One thing the Alderwood militants had done that the local police were irked by was erect a mock gallows in front of the house on 2 separate occasions during their July occupation. They then hung in effigy likenesses of the landlord and the sheriff's offices serving the eviction writs. Such theatrical gibbets were a common form of mockery among those resisting evictions, effigy hangings of bailiffs and offensive rentiers being an important part of the theatrical arsenal of resistance of the jobless. Constituted authority was not pleased by this kind of humor. Police Chief Draper, for instance, took the tongue-in-cheek claims of those resisting street evictions with gallows seriously, and he expressed shocked indignation that agitators at protests were erecting scaffolds from which they ostensibly meant to publicly hang bailiffs and sheriffs. One police officer came to the conclusion that to try to carry out evictions, for instance, in East York in this period, was to court riot and bloodshed. Yet the situation was such in East York that after a year in which some 475 eviction notices had been served, it was still the case that 450 more were threatened. Let me conclude then. The struggle against evictions that raged in Toronto, in which I've really presented only a very small tip of an iceberg to give you some sense of the color of this. These eviction protests that emerged in Toronto and its working class suburbs in 1932 to 1936 constituted nothing less than a war of the dispossessed waged against the property, the powerful, and the politically callous. It signaled the determination of the unemployed, be they in the ranks of single jobless men or embedded in families, that the suffering associated directly with the human consequences of the Great Depression would not be tolerated. Eviction blockades in Toronto in the 1930s were, of course, one small part of the arsenal of the dispossessed, which was wielded at the height of a crisis in which a class war from above was being waged against the working class with intensity. Conventional strikes in workplaces, free speech fights along, what was known as red spadina, the downing of tools by workers forced to labor on public work sites, not for wages but for relief vouchers, hostage takings of welfare administration officials, effigy hangings and burnings, marches on the legislative buildings of Toronto Queen's Park, and occupations of relief offices. All of this was part of the same movement. Conventional understandings of class and class struggle stress that it is the withdrawal of labor that can cripple capital and bring it to its knees. And ultimately, this is undeniably true. But as capitalism attacks the working class with more and more vigorous assaults, and we live in a time in which this is happening, in which its periodic crises constitute a weaponry determined to destroy labor rather than produce it, the nature of class as dispossession necessarily raises awareness of how workers are forced to fight simultaneously on the fronts of production and reproduction. This they did in the 1930s, defending homes as well as wages. Evictions were a substantive and symbolic refusal of dispossession and its discontent. It is an axiom that labor can often fight capital by refusing to be where it is supposed to spend its time, at workplaces where employed laboring people produce the surplus value employers and capitalists crave. This is the weapon of the strike, to withdraw from this situation. We need to appreciate, as did the class struggle activists of the 1930s, how dispossessed labor can also fight capital in its servile state by being where it is not supposed to be. This is the weapon of the occupation. Fighting with this duality of armaments, bringing together the waged and the wageless, resisting on the fronts of both production and reproduction, this is the class struggle agenda of our future. It is emerging in the rise of precarious labor's mobilizations, in the uprisings of the poor in the streets of the urban South, and in the phoenix-like resurrection of militant possibility that beckons from what remains of an often burned-out trade unionism led by ossified officialdoms. Crises of capitalism are forcing the hand of the dispossessed. As ever, the crisis is not restricted to the objective conditions of material decay, however important they undoubtedly are. Rather, the crisis is also subjective, a failure of consciousness and of proletarian leadership, of a contingent of class struggle advocates who can rally the entirety of the dispossessed to a standard of revolutionary resistance that raises the stakes of solidarity to include not simply this or that fragment of the working classes, but the working class as a whole. Thank you.